In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a reclusive collector's death unveils a cryptic riddle promising hidden treasure. As greedy relatives chase gold through shadowy gates, tangled mazes, and ancient crypts, only Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting needles and razor-sharp wit, sees the truth. Will they unearth riches, or discover a legacy far greater than they imagined? In this Agatha Christie-inspired mystery, the wise shall see but only if they look beyond the glitter. Chapter 1. The Passing of Sir Henry. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the gentle folds of the English countryside, was a place where time seemed to linger, as if reluctant to disturb the ivy-clad cottages and the ancient yew trees shading the churchyard. Its residents, accustomed to the rhythm of seasons and the predictable quirks of their neighbours, seldom found cause for uproar. Yet, on a crisp October morning in 1952, a ripple of unease spread through the lanes, born on the heels of a single event, the death of Sir Henry Ashford. Sir Henry, the last of the Ashford line, had lived in the great, crumbling pile of Ashford Hall for nearly 6 decades. A widower since the war, he was a figure of both fascination and distance to the villagers. His tall, stooped frame, clad invariably in tweed, was often seen pacing the manor's overgrown grounds, a battered notebook in hand. He was a collector. They knew antiquities, rare books, and curios from distant lands filled his home, but his true passion was riddles. A man who'd rather puzzle you than speak plainly, the postmistress, Mrs. Cleary, often remarked, though not unkindly. His death, at the age of 78, was no surprise. A heart ailment, the doctor said, had claimed him quietly in his sleep. But the manner of his passing was not what stirred the village. It was what he left behind. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window of her neat cottage on High Street, was among the first to hear the news. Her maid, Lily, brought it with the morning tea, her eyes wide with the thrill of gossip. They found Sir Henry this morning, miss, gone in his armchair by the fire. And there's such talk, of something queer in his will. Miss Marple, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles, raised her mild blue eyes. Queer, Lily? She asked, her tone gentle but expectant. Lily, eager to spill all, leaned closer. Mr. Percival, the solicitor, says there's a letter, sealed up proper, with riddles about a treasure. Hidden, they say, somewhere in the hall. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, betraying no excitement, though her mind was already turning. She knew Ashford Hall, its high gables and shadowed corridors, from visits to Lady Ashford before the war. She knew, too, Sir Henry's reputation for cleverness, a man who delighted in setting traps for the unwary mind. A treasure, she murmured, her voice soft as the autumn light filtering through the lace curtains. How very like Sir Henry to leave a puzzle instead of a legacy. By noon, the village was abuzz. At the Blue Boar Inn, old Mr. Hargreaves, who claimed to have worked at the hall as a boy, spun tales of secret passages and forgotten vaults. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, confided to her bridge circle that Sir Henry had once hinted at a great find from his travels in Egypt, though he'd laughed it off as fancy. Even the children, racing through the churchyard, whispered of gold and jewels buried under the manor's ancient oaks. But Miss Marple, sipping tea with her friend Mrs. Price at the post office, listened with a different ear. People will talk of treasure, she said, her eyes crinkling with a faint smile, but Sir Henry was never one for the obvious. Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a penchant for drama, leaned forward. Do you think it's true, Jane? A fortune hidden away? Why, his relatives are already circling like vultures. She lowered her voice. There's Leonard Ashford, the nephew, a barrister from London, ever so grand but sharp, they say, and Clara Vane, the actress niece, always in the papers. Then that cousin, Dr. Gray, the one who writes those dry books about history. They're all coming for the will tomorrow. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Relatives, she said, have a way of complicating matters, especially when riddles are involved. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the village green, Miss Marple walked to the church to arrange flowers for Sunday's service. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and wood smoke, and the distant silhouette of Ashford Hall loomed against the twilight. She paused by the lich gate, her thoughts drifting to Sir Henry. A man of secrets, yes, but not of malice. His riddles, she suspected, were not mere games. They were a challenge, perhaps a judgment. What did you hide, Sir Henry? She wondered aloud, her voice lost in the rustle of leaves. And who did you mean to find it? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, a shawl about her shoulders, and opened her knitting bag. The village might dream of gold, but she saw something else, a puzzle, intricate and deliberate, woven into the fabric of a man's life. Tomorrow, at the reading of the will, the first threads would unravel, and Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and her sharp, unassuming mind, would be watching. Chapter 2. The Cryptic Will. The morning after Sir Henry Ashford's death dawned grey and heavy, with a mist clinging to the lanes of St. Mary Mead like a mourner's veil. Ashford Hall, its sandstone facade, dulled by the damp, stood silent as a mausoleum, its tall windows reflecting nothing but the clouded sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old leather, beeswax, and the faint mustiness of a house too long neglected. The library, where the reading of Sir Henry's will was to take place, was a cavernous room, its walls lined with sagging bookshelves and portraits of Ashford's past, their eyes seeming to follow the living with disapproval. A fire crackled fitfully in the grate, doing little to dispel the chill that seeped from the stone floors. Miss Jane Marple arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, her black handbag tucked under one arm, her step as brisk as her 70 years allowed. She had been invited, ostensibly as a courtesy, for her acquaintance with the late Lady Ashford and her reputation for quiet wisdom. But Miss Marple knew better than to assume her presence was merely decorative. Sir Henry, with his love of riddles, had a way of drawing people into his games, even from beyond the grave. She took her seat in a her-backed chair near the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the gathering. The room was already filling with Sir Henry's relatives, each radiating a distinct air of expectation. Leonard Ashford, the nephew, stood by the fireplace, his broad shoulders squared in a tailored suit that spoke of London wealth. A barrister of some repute, he had a face that was handsome in a severe way, with sharp grey eyes and a mouth set in a perpetual line of calculation. He adjusted his cufflinks with a deliberate air, as if to remind the room of his importance. A tedious business, this, he said to no one in particular, though his voice carried. Uncle Henry always did enjoy his theatrics. Clara Vane, Sir Henry's niece, swept in moments later, her fur stole slipping artfully from one shoulder. An actress of middling success, she had the kind of beauty that demanded attention: golden curls, wide violet eyes, and a laugh that rang a touch too loud. She sank into a velvet chair with a sigh, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief. "Oh, this dreadful house," she exclaimed, her voice trained for the stage. "It's positively medieval." I do hope Uncle's left us something to brighten the gloom. Her eyes darted to Leonard, who ignored her, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of rivalry in her glance. Dr. Edmund Gray. The cousin was the last to arrive. His thin frame stooped, as if weighed by the volumes of history he penned. His tweed jacket hung loosely, and his spectacles perched precariously on a nose reddened by the cold. He clutched a leather notebook, his fingers stained with ink, and took a seat near the back, avoiding the others' gazes. A scholar, Mrs. Price had called him yesterday, though Miss Marple suspected his dour manner hid more than academic preoccupation. He murmured something about the library's collection, but no one paid him mind. Mr. Percival, Sir Henry's solicitor, entered with the air of a man accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. A small, fastidious figure with a bald head and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried a locked mahogany box, which he placed on the oak table at the room's centre. The relatives' eyes fixed on it, their chatter falling silent. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, watched their faces Leonard's guarded intensity, Clara's theatrical anticipation, Dr. Gray's nervous fidgeting. Greed, she thought, is a poor mask for the heart. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Percival began, his voice dry as parchment, "we are gathered to read the last will and testament of Sir Henry Ashford, dated the 5th of June, 1950. I must warn you, it is unconventional." He unlocked the box with a small key, drawing out a single sheet of paper and a sealed envelope, the latter marked in Sir Henry's spidery hand, "The Riddle of the Hoard." A murmur rippled through the room, and Clara leaned forward, her handkerchief forgotten. Mr. Percival cleared his throat and read the will aloud. It was brief, almost curt. The estate Ashford Hall and its contents was to be held in trust for 1 year, during which the relatives were to reside there if they wished to claim their share. The bulk of Sir Henry's modest fortune was bequeathed to a historical society, with small annuities for Leonard, Clara, and Dr. Gray. "A pittance," Leonard muttered, his jaw tightening. Clara gasped, pressing a hand to her heart. Dr. Gray merely blinked, his fingers tightening on his notebook. But Mr. Percival continued, holding up the sealed envelope. "Sir Henry left this document to be opened in your presence. He described it as a challenge, the resolution of which may alter the disposition of his estate." He broke the seal with a snap, unfolding a single page. The room seemed to hold its breath as he read, "Seek where the shadow falls at noon, where the lion guards the gate. 5 paces north, then turn to fate. The heart of the maze holds the key, but only the wise shall see." The words hung in the air, cryptic and tantalizing. Leonard was the first to break the silence, his voice edged with irritation. "What nonsense is this? A treasure hunt? Uncle Henry's lost his wits long before he lost his life." Clara, however, clapped her hands, her eyes alight. "It's marvelous. A real adventure. He's hidden a fortune, I'm sure of it, gold, jewels, something splendid." Dr. Gray said nothing, but his spectacles glinted as he scribbled in his notebook, his lips moving silently. Mr. Percival raised a hand for quiet. "Sir Henry stipulated that this riddle is to guide you to a hidden asset, the nature of which he did not disclose. You are free to pursue it or not, but the estate remains in trust until the year's end. Should the asset be found, it will be divided equally among those present today, provided they abide by the will's terms." He folded the paper, placing it back in the box. "I will remain in St. Mary Mead to oversee matters. Good day." The relatives erupted as soon as he left. Leonard paced, his hands clasped behind his back. A lion, a maze. It's absurd. The old man's mocking us. Clara, undeterred, spun about the room, her stole trailing like a comet's tail. But think, Leonard, the lion must be that dreadful statue by the gates. And the maze, there's one in the garden, isn't there? Oh, we'll find it by Dr. Gray, still seated, muttered about allegories and medieval symbolism, but his voice was lost in the din. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, resumed her knitting, her eyes flitting from one face to another. Leonard's anger was too quick, she thought, as if he feared being outwitted. Clara's enthusiasm was genuine but shallow, like a child chasing a shiny bauble. Dr. Gray's silence was the most intriguing. His scholarly detachment felt rehearsed, a veil over some deeper intent. She recalled Sir Henry's habit of dining alone, his table strewn with maps and manuscripts. He was a man who saw through people, she mused, and he'd have crafted this riddle to test more than their cleverness. Clara, catching Miss Marple's eye, swept over with a dazzling smile. Miss Marple, you knew Aunt Eleanor, didn't you? And Uncle Henry, a little. What do you make of this riddle? You've a clever head, I can tell. Her flattery was practiced, but Miss Marple returned a mild smile. Sir Henry was fond of precision, my dear. His words will mean exactly what he intended, no more, no less. But riddles, like people, often hide their truths in plain sight. Clara blinked, her smile faltering, then laughed. Oh, you're too wise for me. But I'll wager we'll have that treasure by week's end. Leonard, overhearing, snorted. Don't be a fool, Clara. If there's anything to find, it's likely some dusty relic Uncle Henry overvalued. I'll not waste my time grubbing in the dirt. He turned to Dr. Gray, who was slipping his notebook into his pocket. You're the historian, Edmund. Any notions about this lion and maze business? Dr. Gray adjusted his spectacles, his voice low and precise. The lion could refer to heraldry Ashford's crest, perhaps the maze, possibly a reference to the estate's history. I'd need to consult the archives. His eyes flickered to the bookshelves, and Miss Marple noted the hunger in them. The conversation splintered, each relative retreating into their own plans. Leonard announced he'd summon a surveyor to measure the grounds. Clara, humming a tune, declared she'd explore the maze at once, mud be damned. Dr. Gray, murmuring excuses, slipped toward the library's rear door, his notebook clutched like a talisman. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and made her way to the hall, where Mr. Percival was donning his coat. A curious will, Mr. Percival, she said, her tone light. Did Sir Henry ever speak of this riddle to you? The solicitor hesitated, his fingers pausing on a button. Only once, Miss Marple. He said it was his final jest, meant to sort the wheat from the chaff. His words, not mine. He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Miss Marple in the shadowed hall, her thoughts turning like the gears of a clock. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the tangled gardens and the distant shape of the lion statue by the gate. Miss Marple paused, her eyes tracing its weathered outline. Sir Henry's riddle was no mere whim, she was certain. It was a challenge to perception, a test of character. The relatives saw gold, but she saw something else, a truth buried not in the earth, but in the minds of those who sought it. The wise shall see, she murmured, echoing the riddle's final words. With a small, knowing smile, she turned toward the village, her mind already piecing together the puzzle's first edges. Chapter 3. The Lion's Gate. The sun broke through the morning mist on the second day after Sir Henry Ashford's will was read. casting a pale, watery light over the sprawling grounds of Ashford Hall. The estate, with its unkempt lawns and gnarled oaks, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the secrets buried within its borders to be unearthed. The lion statue, a weathered sentinel of grey stone, stood resolute by the rusted iron gate, its carved mane chipped by time, its eyes fixed on some distant horizon. It was here, at this silent guardian, that the search for Sir Henry's hidden treasure began in earnest. Driven by the cryptic words of his riddle, "Seek where the shadow falls at noon, where the lion guards the gate," Miss Jane Marple, her black straw hat firmly pinned and her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path, arrived at the hall shortly before 11. She carried a parasol, more for propriety than necessity, and her sharp blue eyes took in the scene with the quiet attentiveness of one accustomed to seeing what others overlooked. The air was crisp, scented with wet grass and the faint temps of iron from the gate, and a small crowd had already gathered Sir Henry's relatives, their faces a study in ambition and impatience, and a handful of curious villagers, drawn by the whispers of treasure. Leonard Ashford, the barrister, stood closest to the lion, a surveyor's tape measure in one hand and a pocket watch in the other. His tailored overcoat was immaculate, but his expression was one of barely concealed irritation, as if the riddle's ambiguity was a personal affront. "This is a matter of precision," he declared to no one in particular, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "The shadow at noon, 5 paces north, its simple geometry. I'll have this sorted before lunch." He glanced at his watch, then at the sun, calculating with the intensity of a man who trusted numbers over intuition. Clara Vane, by contrast, was all motion and theatrics, her scarlet scarf fluttering as she paced the path. She had traded her fur stole for a more practical coat, but her golden curls and bright laughter ensured she remained the centre of attention. "Oh, Leonard, don't be so dour," she called, tossing her head. "It's an adventure, like something from a novel. The lion, the gate, the maze, it's positively thrilling." She spun toward the gate, peering at the lion as if it might whisper its secrets. "I'm sure the treasure's in the maze. Uncle Henry loved his little games, didn't he?" Dr. Edmund Gray lingered at the edge of the group, his thin frame hunched against the morning chill. His tweed cap was pulled low, and he clutched a worn satchel, its straps frayed from years of use. He had brought a stack of yellowed maps, which he spread on a nearby bench, muttering about the estate's history. "The lion could be symbolic," he said, half to himself, his voice dry as the rustling leaves. "Ashford Hall was built on a Norman site. There may be older structures, gateways, perhaps long forgotten." His eyes flicked to the statue, then back to his maps, and Miss Marple noted the nervous twitch of his fingers. The villagers, kept at a distance by the hall's elderly groundskeeper, Tom Briggs, watched with a mix of amusement and envy. Tom, a wiry man with a face like cracked leather, leaned on his rake, his eyes sharp beneath his flat cap. "They'll tear up the whole place, mark my words," he muttered to Miss Marple, who had paused beside him. Sir Henry'd laugh to see 'em scrabbling like hounds after a fox. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "Sir Henry," she said softly, "knew how to set a fox running, didn't he, Tom?" The groundskeeper chuckled, but his gaze lingered on the relatives, wary and knowing. As noon approached, Leonard took charge, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Enough speculation. The riddle says noon, and it's nearly time. Everyone, stand back." He positioned himself by the lion, the tape measure stretched taut, and watched the statue's shadow creep across the gravel. The crowd hushed, even Clara falling silent, her eyes wide with anticipation. At precisely 12, Leonard marked the shadow's tip with a stone, then paced 5 steps north, his stride deliberate. He stopped at a patch of overgrown nettles, his face darkening. "Nothing," he said, kicking at the weeds. "Just dirt and thorns." Clara laughed, a high, tinkling sound. "Oh, Leonard, you can't expect it to be that easy. The riddle's cleverer than that. Turn to fate, it says. Maybe we're meant to face a certain direction." She spun in a circle, her scarf trailing, then pointed toward the maze, its tangled hedges visible beyond the lawn. "There, the maze is the heart of this puzzle. I'm sure of it. Uncle Henry used to walk there, didn't he, Tom?" She turned to the groundskeeper, who nodded grudgingly. "Aye, he did. Spent hours in that maze. He did, though it's naught but brambles now." Dr. Gray, still poring over his maps, looked up sharply. "The maze is late Georgian, not Norman," he said, his tone pedantic. "If the riddle points to an older structure, it's not there. The gate itself may be the key perhaps, a hidden mechanism." He approached the iron gate, running his fingers along its rusted bars, but found nothing but flaking paint. Leonard snorted. "Mechanisms? You're chasing fairy tales, Edmund. This is a practical matter, not one of your dusty theories." Miss Marple, standing quietly by the gate, tilted her parasol to shield her eyes from the sun. She watched the relatives bickering with a detached curiosity, her mind sifting through their words like a prospector panning for gold. Leonard's reliance on measurement was predictable, but his frustration betrayed a fear of failure. Clara's romantic notions were charming but scattershot, lacking the discipline to unravel Sir Henry's precision. Dr. Gray's scholarly approach was promising, yet his reticence suggested he knew more than he shared. "They're all looking," she thought, "but none of them are seeing." She turned to Tom Briggs, her voice low. "You've worked here many years, Tom. Did Sir Henry ever speak of the lion or the gate?" Tom scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Not directly, Miss, but he'd stand here sometimes, staring at that statue like it held all the answers. Once, he said something queer. The lion sees what men don't. I thought he was just rambling, but with Sir Henry, you never knew." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Thank you, Tom. That's most interesting." The morning wore on, and the relatives' efforts grew more frantic. Leonard, undeterred by his initial failure, borrowed a spade from Tom and began digging at the base of the nettles, his coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up. The villagers whispered, some betting he'd unearth a chest of gold, others scoffing at his labor. Clara, tiring of the gate, flounced toward the maze, declaring she'd feel the answer in her bones. She disappeared into its green corridors, her laughter echoing back. Dr. Gray, meanwhile, retreated to his maps, sketching the estates. Lay out with a pencil, his lips moving as if reciting the riddle to himself. Miss Marple strolled slowly around the lion statue, her parasol tapping the ground. The stone was old, its surface pitted by centuries of rain, but its craftsmanship was evident in the curve of its mane and the proud tilt of its head. She studied the gate, its iron bars twisted into an ornate pattern, and noted how the lion's shadow fell across them at noon, creating a fleeting design that vanished as the sun moved. A shadow, she murmured, is a fleeting thing, but Sir Henry was never fleeting in his intent. She glanced at the maze, its dark hedges looming like a riddle within a riddle, and filed the thought away. By mid-afternoon, the search had yielded nothing but sore tempers. Leonard's digging uncovered only roots and a broken clay pipe, which he flung aside in disgust. Clara emerged from the maze, her coat snagged and her curls dishevelled, complaining of dead ends and spiders. "It's a beastly place," she cried, flopping onto a bench. "But I'm not giving up. The treasure's there, I know it." Dr. Gray, who had barely moved from his maps, folded them carefully and announced he'd continue his research in the library. "The answer lies in history," he said, his voice clipped, "not in digging like a labourer." Leonard shot him a withering look, but said nothing. Miss Marple, sensing the group's fatigue, approached Clara with a kindly smile. "You've a brave spirit, my dear, tackling that maze alone. Did you find anything curious?" Clara sighed, brushing a leaf from her sleeve. "Only that it's a dreadful tangle. But there's a clearing in the middle, with a sort of stone table. I thought it might be important, but it's just moss and cracks." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A stone table, you say? How interesting. Sir Henry was fond of such places, wasn't he?" Clara shrugged, her interest waning, and turned to flirt with a young villager who'd strayed too close as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. Miss Marple made her way back to the village, her mind alive with fragments of the morning's observations. The lion, the gate, the mazage was a piece of Sir Henry's puzzle. But their meaning lay not in the objects themselves, but in how they were perceived. Leonard saw a problem to be solved, Clara a story to be lived, Dr. Gray a text to be studied. Yet Sir Henry, she suspected, had crafted his riddle for someone who could see beyond the surface, someone who understood the interplay of light and shadow, of truth and deception. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, a cup of tea steaming beside her. She opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their rhythmic dance, but her thoughts were far from the wool. The lion's gate was a starting point, but the riddle's heart lay elsewhere, perhaps in the maze, perhaps in something less tangible. "The wise shall see," she murmured, echoing Sir Henry's words. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and her unerring knack for human nature, was beginning to see indeed. Chapter 4. The Maze's Secret. The third morning after the reading of Sir Henry Ashford's will broke with a soft golden light that gilded the tangled gardens of Ashford Hall, casting long shadows across the dew-soaked grass. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of autumn leaves and the faint hum of bees stirring in the late-blooming roses. At the heart of the estate's grounds, the hedge maze stood like a silent enigma, its overgrown use forming a labyrinth that had not been tended in years. Its paths, once clipped to precision, were now choked with brambles and moss, yet it drew the attention of Sir Henry's relatives like a magnet. Pulled by the riddle's tantalizing promise, the heart of the maze holds the key, but only the wise shall see. Miss Jane Marple, clad in a tweed coat and her ever-present black hat, arrived at the hall shortly after breakfast, her step measured but purposeful. She carried her knitting bag, a quiet emblem of her unobtrusive presence, and her parasol, which she used more as a walking stick on the uneven paths. The maze, she knew, was the next stage of Sir Henry's puzzle, and she was eager to observe how the relatives would navigate its twists, both literal and figurative. Her mild blue eyes scanned the scene with the clarity of one who saw not just the surface of things, but the currents beneath. The maze's entrance, a narrow gap between towering hedges, was already a hive of activity. Clara Vane, her scarlet scarf a vivid slash against the green, stood poised like an actress awaiting her cue. She had recovered from yesterday's dishevelled retreat and now exuded a renewed determination, her violet eyes sparkling with the thrill. of the chase. This is where it all happens. I feel it, she declared, her voice carrying to the small knot of villagers who lingered at a respectful distance. The maze is Uncle Henry's grand stage, and I'll find that key. She adjusted her gloves as if preparing for a duel and plunged into the labyrinth, her laughter echoing back. Leonard Ashford, ever the pragmatist, approached the maze with the air of a general surveying a battlefield. He carried a notebook and a ball of twine, the latter a nod to the myth of Theseus, though he would never admit to such fanciful thinking. His broad face was set in a frown, his grey eyes narrowed as he studied the maze's entrance. "This is no place for theatrics," he muttered, glancing at Clara's retreating figure. "The riddle demands method, measurement, logic. I'll map every turn before I waste my time wandering." He began unspooling the twine. Tying one end to a stake, he drove into the ground, his movements precise and unhurried. Dr. Edmund Gray, by contrast, lingered at the maze's periphery, his satchel slung over one shoulder and his tweed cap pulled low. He had brought a leather-bound volume on medieval garden design, which he consulted with the intensity of a monk deciphering scripture. Mazes were often symbolic, he said to no one in particular, his voice thin and reedy. A journey to enlightenment or a test of faith. The heart may not be literal, it could be an allegory, a hidden truth. He traced a finger over a diagram in his book, then glanced at the maze, his spectacles glinting in the sunlight. Miss Marple, watching from a nearby bench, noted the tension in his posture, as if he feared the maze might reveal more than he wished. Tom Briggs, the groundskeeper, was raking leaves near the maze's entrance, his weathered face creased with amusement at the relative's fervour. He caught Miss Marple's eye and tipped his cap. "They're like children after a prize, ain't they, miss? But that maze ain't given up its secrets in my time, nor Sir Henry's neither." Miss Marple smiled, settling onto the bench with her knitting. "Sir Henry was fond of the maze, wasn't he, Tom?" she asked, her tone conversational. Tom leaned on his rake, considering. He'd walk it near every day, even when the paths grew wild. Said it cleared his mind. Always ended at the centre by that old sundial. Queer thing that Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her mind seized on the word sundial. Clara had mentioned a stone table yesterday, likely the same structure. A sundial. "You say," she prompted, her voice gentle. Tom nodded. "Aye, cracked and mossy, but Sir Henry set store by it. He'd sit there, scribbling in his notebook, muttering about time and keys. I never paid it much mind. Gentlemen have their fancies, don't they?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed they do, Tom. And Sir Henry's fancies were never idle." The morning unfolded with a flurry of activity, each relative pursuing the maze in their own way. Clara, undaunted by the brambles, darted through the paths, her scarf catching on thorns as she called out her progress. "Left, then righto, a dead end. No, here's a turn." Her voice, bright with excitement, drew smiles from the villagers, who saw her as a heroine in a melodrama. But her enthusiasm outstripped her sense, and within an hour she emerged at the entrance, her gloves torn and her face flushed. "It's a beastly puzzle," she cried, flopping onto the grass. "But I found the centre. There's a sundial, just as Tom said. Nothing else though. No key, no treasure, just weeds." Leonard, methodical as ever, had made slower progress. His twine trailed behind him like a lifeline, and he paused every few steps to sketch the maze's layout in his notebook. "It's a grid," he explained to a villager who ventured too close, his tone clipped. 4 main paths, branching into 8, with subpaths at irregular intervals. The center is roughly circular, based on Clara's babbling. He reached the sundial by mid-morning, his twine a tangled mess, but his map impressively detailed. He examined the sundialer low, circular stone platform, its bronze gnomon rusted and its surface etched with faint Roman numerals. No inscriptions. No compartments, he muttered, tapping the stone with his pencil. This can't be the heart. Dr. Gray, who had entered the maze only after consulting his book, took a different approach. He moved slowly, pausing at each junction to compare the paths to his diagrams. Mazes often follow sacred geometry, he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. The center is the goal, but the journey is the meaning. When he reached the sundial, he knelt beside it, his fingers tracing the Latin inscription carved into its rim. Tempus veritatem, revelatim, reveals truth. His eyes narrowed, and he scribbled the phrase in his notebook, his hand trembling slightly. Miss Marple, who had followed at a discreet distance, noted the intensity of his focus. He sees something, she thought, but he's not ready to share it. The sundial, as Clara and Leonard had described, was unremarkable at first glance. Its stone was weathered, its edges softened by moss, and the bronze gnomon cast a faint shadow that shifted with the sun. Yet Miss Marple, circling it slowly, felt a prickle of intuition. Sir Henry had been no casual gardener. His daily walks to this spot, his muttered words about keys, suggested a purpose. She knelt, her gloved fingers brushing the inscription, and noticed a faint seam in the stone's base, barely visible beneath the moss. She pressed it gently, but it yielded nothing. "Not yet," she murmured, straightening. "But you're here, aren't you, Sir Henry?" The villagers, growing bored, began to drift away, their whispers of treasure fading into complaints about the damp. Clara, after a brief rest, rallied her spirits and re-entered the maze, determined to find a hidden door or secret path. "It's like a play," she called to Leonard, who ignored her. "There's always a trap door in the third act." Leonard, his patience fraying, snapped his notebook shut. "This isn't one of your farces, Clara. If the key's here, it's physical, a lock, a box, something tangible. I'll measure the clearing next, check for anomalies." He began pacing the sundial's perimeter, his twine trailing like a spider's web. Dr. Gray, meanwhile, retreated to the maze's entrance, his satchel clutched to his chest. He avoided Miss Marple's gaze, but she saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. "He's found a clue," she thought, "and it frightens him." She approached him, her smile disarming. "You've a scholar's mind, Dr. Gray. That inscription, Tempus veritatem, revelatis, rather poetic, isn't it?" Gray started, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "It's common enough," he said quickly. "Medieval sundials often bore such phrases. It means nothing." But his voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away his discomfort. As the afternoon waned, the relatives' efforts grew desperate. Clara, scratched and muddy, emerged from the maze a second time, her enthusiasm dampened but not extinguished. "I've tried every path," she sighed, sinking onto Miss Marple's bench. "It's just a maze, not a treasure chest." "But that sundial, it feels important, doesn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression kindly. "Sir Henry was fond of symbols, my dear. Perhaps the sundial is a signpost, not the destination." Clara blinked, then laughed. "You're too clever, Miss Marple. I'll think on it over tea." Leonard, his map now a labyrinth of its own, began digging around the sundial, his spade striking roots and stones. "If there's a key, it's buried," he grunted, his face red with exertion, but his efforts uncovered only a rusted horseshoe, which he tossed aside in disgust. Dr. Gray, who had returned to the sundial, knelt again, his fingers probing the stone's edges. He froze when Leonard approached, then stood abruptly, muttering about the library. "I need records," he said, and hurried off, his satchel bouncing against his hip. Miss Marple remained by the maze, her knitting a steady rhythm against the fading light. The sundial, she suspected, was indeed the heart of the maze, but its secret was not a simple lock or buried box. Sir Henry's riddle was a test of perception, designed to reveal as much about the seeker as the sought. Clara's impulsiveness, Leonard's rigidity, Gray's secrecy just was a flaw Sir Henry had anticipated. "The wise shall see," she murmured, her eyes on the sundial's shadow, now stretching long and thin across the clearing dot as the sun dipped below the hedges. Casting the maze into twilight, Miss Marple gathered her things and made her way back to the village. The day had yielded no treasure, but it had illuminated the players in Sir Henry's game. The sundial held a key, she was certain not of metal, but of meaning, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and her knack for seeing through the tangles of human nature, was one step closer to unlocking it. Chapter 5. A village stirred by the fourth day following the reading of Sir Henry Ashford's will. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead had transformed into a crucible of whispers and speculation. The riddle of the hidden treasure, with its tantalizing clues of lions, mazes, and keys, had seeped beyond the walls of Ashford Hall, igniting imaginations in cottages and alehouses alike. The morning air, sharp with the bite of late October, carried snippets of gossip as villagers gathered at the post office, the bakery, and the lich gate of St. Mary's Church, each eager to add their own flourish to the tale. To them, Sir Henry's legacy was no longer just a family matter. It was a drama unfolding on their doorstep, and they were loath to miss a single act. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage window with a cup of tea and her knitting, observed the stir with her usual calm detachment. Her view of High Street afforded her a front-row seat to the comings and goings of the village, and she noted the quickened steps of Mrs. Cleary, the postmistress, and the furtive glances of young Billy Turner, who loitered by the Blue Boar in hoping to overhear something new. The riddle, she mused, had done more than set Sir Henry's relatives scrambling. It had stirred the village's dormant curiosity, revealing the fault lines of envy and ambition that ran beneath its placid surface. "People," she said softly to her cat, Tuppence, who dozed on the window-sill, "are never so revealing as when they think they're chasing a prize." The catalyst for the village's fervour was the arrival of two outsiders, drawn to St. Mary Mead by the scent of opportunity. The first was Mr. Silas Crowe, an antiques dealer from London, whose sleek black car had rolled into the village the previous evening, a man of middle years with slicked-back hair and a smile too polished to be sincere. He had taken a room at the Blue Boar and wasted no time ingratiating himself with the locals. His tailored suit and gold pocket watch marked him as a man of means, but his eye sharp and restless suggested a predator's instinct. "He's after the treasure, mark my words," Mrs. Price had declared at the vicarage tea, her voice low with disapproval. "Says he knew Sir Henry, but I don't believe a word of it." The second newcomer was Miss Lydia Finch, a journalist for a London tabloid, whose arrival was announced by the clatter of her typewriter in the inn's parlour. A wiry woman with bobbed hair and a penchant for bright lipstick, she had a knack for asking questions that lingered like burrs. By breakfast, she had already interviewed half the village, her notebook filled with tales of Sir Henry's eccentricities and the relative squabbles. "She's writing a story," Lily, Miss Marple's maid, reported breathlessly, setting down the Morning Post. "Says it'll be the talk of Londoner, real treasure hunt, with riddles and all." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Miss Finch," she said, "will find more than she expects, and less than she hopes." The village's agitation was not helped by the behaviour of Sir Henry's relatives, whose pursuit of the riddle had spilled into public view. Leonard Ashford, his patience fraying, had taken to striding through the village with a surveyor's map, barking orders at anyone who crossed his path. At the post office, he demanded access to old estate records, only to be rebuffed by Mrs. Cleary, who sniffed that such things were not for the likes of him. Clara Vane, ever the performer, had charmed a group of village lads into helping her clear brambles from the maze, her laughter drawing crowds to the hall's gates. Dr. Edmund Gray, by contrast, had grown more withdrawn, spending hours in the manor's library and avoiding the village altogether. "He's up to something," Billy Turner whispered to his mates, sneaking about like a ghost. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, reflected on the relatives' divergent paths. Leonard's bluster masked a fear of being outwitted. Clara's charm concealed a desperate need for validation, and Gray's secrecy hinted at knowledge he dared not share. Sir Henry's riddle, she suspected, was designed to expose such weaknesses, to sift the greedy from the discerning. He knew them. She murmured, her eyes on the street where Clara's scarlet scarf flashed past. He knew exactly how they'd behave. The morning's gossip reached a fever pitch when Leonard and Clara clashed publicly outside the Blue Boar. Miss Marple, on her way to the vicarage for a parish meeting, paused to observe from across the green. Leonard, his face flushed, was brandishing a newspaper, Miss Finch's latest dispatch, which had somehow reached the village before its London readers. "You've made us a laughingstock, Clara," he shouted, waving the paper, "leaking Uncle's riddle to this scandal sheet. Do you want every fortune hunter in England descending on us?" Clara, unruffled, tossed her curls. "Oh, Leonard, don't be such a bore. Publicity is power, darling. If there's treasure, the world should know we're the ones to find it." The villagers, drawn by the commotion, gathered in knots, their whispers a low hum. Miss Finch, perched on the inn steps, scribbled furiously, her eyes gleaming. Silas Crowe, lounging nearby with a cigarette, watched the scene with a faint smirk, as if sizing up a chessboard. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her quiet corner, noted the dynamics. Leonard's anger was genuine but overplayed. Clara's defiance, a performance for the crowd, and the outsider's interest, a complication, sir. Henry could not have foreseen. Or could he, she wondered, her needles pausing. He knew human nature, after all. At the vicarage, over scones and Darjeeling, Miss Marple gleaned more from the vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, a woman whose gentle demeanour belied a sharp memory. Sir Henry was a peculiar man, Mrs. Harmon said, passing the jam. He funded the church crypt's restoration years ago, you know, insisted on overseeing it himself. He was fascinated by the carving slions, mazes, all sorts of odd symbols. Said they told a story, though he never explained what. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Carvings, you say? How very curious. Did he visit the crypt often?" Mrs. Harmon nodded. "Oh yes, especially in his last years. He'd sit there for hours, sketching. I thought it was just his way, but now, with this riddle, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning. The crypt, with its ancient stone and hidden history, was a new piece in the puzzle, one the relatives had yet to consider. Lions and mazes, recurring motifs in Sir Henry's riddle, suggested a connection, perhaps a clue he had embedded in the church itself. Sir Henry, she said softly, was a man who left breadcrumbs, even in sacred places. Mrs. Harmon, catching her tone, leaned forward. Do you think the treasure's there, Jane, in the church? Miss Marple smiled, her expression enigmatic. I think, my dear, that Sir Henry's treasure is wherever he wished us to look. The afternoon brought Miss Marple to the church, a Norman structure whose weathered stones bore the weight of centuries. The crypt, accessible through a side door, was cool and dim, its air heavy with the scent of damp earth and wax. She descended. The narrow steps, her gloved hands steady on the iron rail, and found herself in a low-vaulted chamber, its walls adorned with faded carvings. Lions, their manes, stylized in swirling patterns, stared from one panel. A maze, its paths etched in precise lines, adorned another. At the far end, a hooded figure held a key, its face obscured by shadow. Miss Marple's breath caught not from fear, but from recognition. You were here, weren't you, Sir Henry? She murmured, her fingers brushing the stone. She was not alone for long. Dr. Gray, his satchel slung over his shoulder, appeared at the crypt's entrance, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He froze at the sight of her, his spectacles glinting in the faint light. Miss Marple, he stammered, clutching his notebook. I was merely researching the crypt's history, you know, relevant to the estate. His voice was too quick, his eyes darting to the carvings. Miss Marple smiled, her tone disarming. Of course, Dr. Gray, these carvings are most intriguing, aren't they? Lions, mazes almost, as if Sir Henry left us a map. Gray's fingers tightened on his notebook, but he managed a nod. Perhaps, he said, and retreated up the steps, his haste betraying more than his words. Miss Marple lingered, examining the lion carving. Its head was proud, its eyes deep-set, one slightly larger than the other. She pressed it gently, recalling a similar trick in old manor houses, but the stone remained firm. Not yet, she thought, stepping back. The crypt was a clue, but its secret required patience, a quality the relatives lacked. She ascended to the churchyard, her mind weaving connections between the crypt, the lion statue, and the maze's sundial. Sir Henry's riddle was a tapestry, its threads spanning the estate and the village, and she was beginning to see its pattern. Back in the village, the stir continued. Leonard, stung by Clara's publicity stunt, had retreated to the hall, where he pored over maps with renewed vigor. Clara, undaunted, had enlisted Miss Finch to photograph her at the maze's entrance, posing with a trowel like an explorer. It'll be marvelous in the papers, she gushed, oblivious to the journalists. Sly smile. Silas Crowe, meanwhile, had taken to questioning Tom Briggs, offering vague promises of partnership in exchange for insights about the hall. Tom, loyal to Sir Henry's memory, rebuffed him with a curt, "Mind your own business, Mr. Miss Marple," returning to her cottage, paused at the post office to collect her letters. Mrs. Cleary, eager for news, leaned over the counter. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple? All this talk of treasure, and now these strangers poking about." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I think, Mrs. Cleary, that Sir Henry has given us a puzzle to solve, and not all the pieces are gold." She left the postmistress pondering and made her way home. where Tuppence greeted her with a yawn dot as evening fell. Miss Marple settled by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm against the crackle of logs. The villagers' stir was a distraction, but it had illuminated new facets of Sir Henry's game. The Crypt's carvings, Grey's secrecy, Crow's opportunism, Finch's prying all were threads in the same tapestry. "The wise shall see," she murmured, echoing the Riddle's final words. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and her unerring sense of human folly, was seeing more with each passing day. Chapter 6. The church crypt, the 5th day since the reading of Sir Henry. Ashford's will dawned with a restless energy in St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself was straining to unravel the riddle that had set its inhabitants abuzz. The morning sky was a patchwork of grey clouds, their edges tinged with the pale gold of a sun struggling to break through. The air carried a damp chill, and the cobbled lanes glistened with the remnants of an overnight drizzle. At the heart of the village, St. Mary's Church stood solemn and ancient, its Norman tower a silent witness to centuries of secrets. It was to this sacred ground that Miss Jane Marple directed her steps, drawn by Mrs. Harmon's mention of the Crypt's carvings and her own growing conviction that Sir Henry's riddle extended beyond the boundaries of Ashford Hall. Miss Marple, clad in a sensible wool coat and her black straw hat, walked with the steady purpose of one who knew her destination but was in no hurry to arrive. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, a quiet emblem of her unassuming presence, and her parasol tapped the ground like a metronome. The churchyard, with its mossy headstones and yew trees, was quiet save for the distant caw of a rook. She paused by the lich gate, her sharp blue eyes taking in the scene, the church's weathered stone, the path leading to the side door, and the faint hum of village life beyond. "Sir Henry," she murmured, "you've led us a merry dance, but I suspect your trail runs through here." The crypt, as Mrs. Harmon had described, was a relic of the church's medieval origins, its entrance tucked behind a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. Miss Marple descended the narrow stone steps, her gloved hand steady on the cold rail, and entered a low-vaulted chamber that seemed to exhale the weight of ages. The air was cool and heavy, scented with damp earth and the faint wax of long extinguished. Candles, a single electric bulb, hung from a wire, cast a feeble glow, its light dancing across the walls where ancient carvings told stories in stone. Lions, their manes swirling like flames, glared from one panel. A maze, its paths etched with precision, wound across another. At the far end, a hooded figure clutched a key, its face lost in shadow. Miss Marple's breath caught not from the chill, but from the realization that these images echoed the riddle's motifs with uncanny clarity. She moved slowly, her parasol tapping the flagstone floor, and examined the lion carving. Its head was proud, its eyes deep set, one slightly larger than the other, as if carved with deliberate asymmetry. She pressed the larger eye gently, recalling tales of hidden mechanisms in old churches, but the stone remained unyielding. "Patience," she whispered, stepping back. The crypt was a clue, she was certain, but its secret demanded more than a simple touch. Sir Henry, with his love of misdirection, would have crafted a puzzle that rewarded insight over haste. Her solitude was short-lived. The creak of the door above announced an intruder, and Dr. Edmund Gray descended, his thin frame silhouetted against the daylight. His tweed cap was askew, and his satchel bulged with papers, his fingers ink-stained as always. He froze at the sight of Miss Marple, his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Miss Marple," he stammered, clutching his notebook like a shield. "I," I was merely researching. The crypt's carvings relevant to the estate's history, you know. His voice was too quick, his eyes darting to the lion panel, and Miss Marple noted the bead of sweat on his brow despite the crypt's chill. How fortunate we share an interest. Dr. Gray, she said, her tone mild as milk. These carvings are most striking, aren't they? Lions, mazes, keys so like Sir Henry's Riddle. She smiled, her eyes never leaving his face. Gray's fingers tightened on his notebook, and he adjusted his spectacles with a nervous twitch. Yes, well, medieval iconography often repeats such symbols. Nothing remarkable. But his gaze lingered on the lion's uneven eyes, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of recognition he could not hide. Perhaps, she said, her needles clicking faintly from her bag. But Sir Henry was never one for the unremarkable, was he? Gray muttered something about cross-referencing texts and retreated to a corner, where he began sketching the carvings with a pencil that trembled slightly. Miss Marple watched him, her mind sifting through his unease. He knew something, perhaps a detail from the manor's archives, or a connection between the crypt and the riddle's clues. His secrecy, she thought, was not born of greed alone, but of a scholar's obsession, a need to claim the discovery for himself. He's close, she mused, but he's afraid of what he'll find. Leaving Gray to his sketches, Miss Marple ascended to the churchyard, where the village's stir was making itself felt. Clara Vane, her scarlet scarf a beacon, was holding court by the lich gate, regaling a cluster of villagers with tales of her maze adventures. "It's like a fairy tale," she cried, her violet eyes wide with drama. "A treasure hidden in the heart of a labyrinth, guarded by a lion. I'm sure we'll find it soon. Perhaps a golden key or a chest of jewels." The villagers, charmed by her theatrics, hung on her words, though Miss Marple noted the sceptical glance of Mrs. Cleary, who muttered about silly girls and their fancies. Leonard Ashford, meanwhile, had taken his search to the village, his surveyor's map tucked under his arm. He stood outside the post office, quizzing old Mr. Hargreaves about the hall's boundaries, his voice sharp with frustration. There must be records, he insisted, deeds, plans, something to pinpoint this wretched gate. Mr. Hargreaves, puffing on his pipe, shook his head. Sir Henry kept his own counsel, Mr. Ashford. If there's a gate, it's one he hid well. Leonard's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple, passing by, saw the strain in his eyes. A man who feared not just failure, but ridicule. The outsiders, Silas Crowe and Lydia Finch, were also making their presence felt. Crowe, his slick hair gleaming, had taken to lingering near the church, his cigarette smoke curling in the air as he watched the relatives' comings and goings. Miss Marple, pausing by a headstone, overheard him chatting with Billy Turner, the village lad, his voice smooth as oil. "A clever boy like you must know the hall's secrets," he said, slipping a shilling into Billy's hand. "Any tales of hidden rooms, eh?" Billy, torn between loyalty and temptation, mumbled something vague and fled. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Mr. Crowe, she thought, is fishing in murky waters. Miss Finch, meanwhile, had set up her typewriter on a bench in the churchyard, her fingers flying as she drafted another article. She cornered Clara, her notebook at the ready. "Miss Vane, tell me about this maze business. Is it true you found a sundial? Any sign of the treasure?" Clara, flattered by the attention, spilled details with abandon, her laughter ringing out. "Oh, it's all terribly exciting. The sundial's at the center, but it's just stone and moss. I'm sure there's a secret door somewhere." Miss Finch's eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple, watching from a distance, saw the danger in such reckless talk. Words, she thought, are as perilous as clues in the wrong hands. The afternoon brought a new development. At the Blue Boar, over a lunch of cold ham and pickles, Leonard confronted Clara about her indiscretions, his voice carrying to the bar. "You're feeding that journalist nonsense, Clara, and drawing. Every opportunist in the county, crows sniffing around like a fox do. You want him to steal our inheritance." Clara, sipping sherry, laughed it off. "Don't be absurd, Leonard. Mr. Crow's a gentleman, and publicity will only help us. If the treasure's found, I want my name in lights." Leonard slammed his glass down, his face red. "You're a fool, and you'll ruin us all." The villagers, pretending not to listen, exchanged knowing glances, and Miss Marple, sipping tea at a corner table, filed away the rift. Her thoughts were interrupted by Tom Briggs, who approached with a nod. "Miss Marple, a word, if you please. That Crow fellow's been asking about Sir Henry's habits, where he walked, what he kept in the hole. I told him naught, but he's persistent." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Thank you, Tom. Mr. Crow is a man who sees profit in others. Secrets, best to keep him at arm's length." Tom tipped his cap and returned to his work, but Miss Marple's mind was alight. Crow's interest was no idle curiosity. He was a player in Sir Henry's game, whether he knew it or not. Returning to the crypt in the late afternoon, Miss Marple found it empty, Gray's sketches abandoned on a ledge. She examined them, closely detailed renderings of the lion and maze, with notes in a cramped hand, asymmetrical eye mechanism, and maze as metaphor. Gray was circling the truth, she realized, but his fear of exposure held him back. She turned to the hooded figure, its key carved with intricate detail, and wondered if it represented Sir Henry himself, guardian of knowledge, watching from the shadows. "You're close, aren't you?" she murmured, her fingers brushing the stone as dusk fell. Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, the village settling into its evening rhythms. The stir had not abated. Crow's car was parked outside. The Infinch's typewriter clattered on, and the relatives' voices carried from the hall's gates. But Miss Marple saw beyond the noise, to the Riddle's quiet heart. The crypt, with its silent carvings, was a mirror of Sir Henry's mind, reflecting his love of history and his disdain for greed. "The wise shall see," she whispered, echoing the Riddle's promise, and Miss Marple, with her patient wisdom and her gift for piercing the veils of human nature, was seeing more clearly than ever. Chapter 7. A Midnight Intrusion. The 6th night since the reading of Sir Henry Ashford's will cloaked St. Mary Mead in a velvet darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of lamplight from cottage windows and the distant hoot of an owl. In the churchyard used the village, so animated by day with the fever of treasure hunting, had settled into an uneasy quiet, as if holding its breath for the next act in the drama unfolding at Ashford Hall. The great house itself loomed against the starless sky, its gables sharp as secrets, its walls guarding the riddle that had set hearts racing and tongues wagging. Yet beneath this stillness, a current of unrest stirred, and Miss Jane Marple, awake in her cottage, with a cup of cocoa and her knitting, sensed it as surely as a sailor feels the coming storm. Miss Marple's cottage, neat and cosy on High Street, was a haven of order, its chintz curtains drawn against the night. She sat by the fire, her needles clicking in a rhythm that belied the alertness of her mind. The day's events, the crypt's carvings, Dr. Gray's furtive sketches, Clara's reckless chatter, and Silas Crow's predatory interest had woven a tapestry of motives and missteps, each thread leading back to Sir Henry's riddle. At midnight hour, she murmured to her cat Tuppence, who blinked from the hearthrug, is when secrets slip their chains. Her words proved prophetic, for, at that very moment, a shadow moved across the grounds of Ashford Hall, unseen but not unfelt. The intrusion began just after midnight, when Tom Briggs, the groundskeeper, was roused from his sleep by the creak of a gate. Tom, who lived in a small cottage near the Hall's stables, was a light sleeper, his years tending the estate having honed his senses to its every sound. He pulled on his boots, lit a lantern, and stepped into the night, his breath clouding. In the chill air, the grounds were silent, save for the rustle of leaves, but as he neared the lion statue by the gate, he caught a flicker of movement, a figure, cloaked in darkness, slipping through the shrubbery toward the manor's west wing. "Who's there?" Tom called, his voice gruff but steady. The figure froze, then bolted, and Tom, spry despite his years, gave chase. The pursuit was brief but telling. The intruder, hampered by the tangled undergrowth, stumbled near the mazes. Entrance, and Tom's lantern caught a glimpse of a tailored coat and slicked back hair before the figure vanished into the shadows. It was Silas Crow, the antiques dealer, whose polished charm had not fooled the groundskeeper. Tom, knowing better than to tackle a man alone in the dark, returned to his cottage and telephoned the village constable, Mr. Dobbs, a stolid man, with a fondness for routine. By 1 o'clock, Dobbs was at the Hall, his bicycle propped against the gate, his torch sweeping the grounds. Miss Marple learned of the incident at breakfast, when Lily, her maid, arrived with wide eyes and a tray of tea and toast. "Oh, miss, there's been a to-do at the Hall," Lily gasped, setting the tray down with a clatter. Tom Briggs caught that Mr. Crow sneaking about last night, bold as brass. Constable Dobbs searched him, but he'd naught but a torch and a pocket-knife. Said he was lost, if you please, taking a midnight stroll. Lily's indignation was matched by her relish for the tale, and Miss Marple, buttering her toast, listened with quiet interest. "Lost was he," she said, her tone mild. How very careless of Mr. Crow. And what did Tom make of it? "Tom says he's a thief, miss, plain and simple," Lily replied, pouring tea. "Says Crow was after the treasure, poking about the manor to find it before the others. Constable Dobbs let him off with a warning, but he's to leave the village by noon, or there'll be trouble." Miss Marple's needles, resting in her lap, gave a single click. "A warning," she murmured. "That will not deter a man like Mr. Crow. Thank you, Lily. You've been most informative." As Lily bustled off, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the intrusion like a jeweller inspecting a flawed gem. The village, by mid-morning, was alight with the news. At the post office, Mrs. Cleary recounted the tale to every customer, embellishing it with her own suspicions. "He's a crook, that Crow, with his fancy talk and his gold watch," she declared, stamping a letter with unnecessary force. "After Sir Henry's antiques, I'll wager, or whatever's in that treasure." The Blue Boar buzzed with similar talk, where old Mr. Hargreaves spun a yarn about a secret vault in the Hall's cellars, prompting nods and sceptical snorts. Even the children, playing by the church, whispered of the midnight man, their games now tinged with the thrill of danger. Miss Marple, on her way to the vicarage for a parish meeting, paused at the churchyard to observe the villagers' mood. The stir of the past days had deepened, fueled by Crow's misadventure and the relatives' relentless pursuit of the riddle. Clara Vane, she learned, had spent the morning at the hall, rummaging through Sir Henry's study in search of new clues. Leonard Ashford, undeterred by the maze's dead ends, had hired a local lad to help him survey the grounds anew. His maps growing ever more intricate, Dr. Edmund Gray, meanwhile, had not left the manor's library since dawn. His absence from the village noted by all. "He's on to something," Mrs. Price confided at the vicarage, her voice low. "Mark my words, Jane, that man's got secrets." The vicarage, with its rose-covered walls and cheerful clutter, was a welcome respite from the village's clamour. Over tea and fruitcake, Miss Marple listened as Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, shared her own observations. "It's all so unsettling," Mrs. Harmon said, refilling Miss Marple's cup. "This treasure business has turned everyone's head. Even the vicar's worried, says the crypt's become a tourist attraction, what with Dr. Gray poking about, and Clara asking questions about old church records." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Clara, too. How industrious of her, and what did she want with the records? "Oh, something about Sir Henry's donations," Mrs. Harmon replied, slicing. "Cake. She thinks he hid a clue in the church accounts, of all places. Found nothing, of course, but she's convinced there's a code somewhere." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. Clara's flair for drama was undirected, but her instinct to look beyond the obvious was not entirely misguided. "Sir Henry," she said softly, "was a man who hid truths in plain sight. The church may yet hold his answer." The afternoon brought Miss Marple back to Ashford Hall, where the relatives' tensions were reaching a breaking point. She found Clara in the manor's drawing room, her scarlet scarf draped over a chair as she sorted through a pile of Sir Henry's papers. The room, with its faded velvet curtains and portraits of stern Ashfords, was a study in decay, its grandeur eroded by time. Clara, flushed with excitement, waved a yellowed sketch at Miss Marple. "Look at this, Miss Marple. I found it in Uncle Henry's desk, a drawing of the maze, with a star at the centre. It's got to mean something, don't you think?" The sketch was crude, its lines smudged, but the star marked the sundial's location with unmistakable clarity. Miss Marple examined it, her expression serene. "Most intriguing, my dear. Sir Henry was fond of such markers, wasn't he? Did you show this to the others?" Clara's smile faltered. "Not yet. Leonard's so beastly, he'd snatch it and claim the credit. And Edmund, well, he's been odd, hasn't he? Always in the library, muttering to himself." Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly. "Dr. Gray is a scholar, Clara scholars. Often see what others miss, but they also guard their finds." Clara laughed, tossing her curls. "You're too clever, Miss Marple. I'll keep this safe until I'm sure." The drawing-room door swung open, and Leonard strode in, his face thunderous. He held a crumpled letter, its wax seal broken. "Clara, you've gone too far," he snapped, brandishing the paper. "Writing to that journalist again, inviting her to poke about the hall. And now this crow sneaking in, thanks to your loose tongue." Clara rose, her chin high. "Don't be absurd, Leonard. I didn't invite Crow, and Miss Finch is helping. She make us famous when we find the treasure." Leonard's eyes narrowed. "If there's a treasure, Clara, you'll have given it away before we touch it." Miss Marple, seated quietly, watched the exchange with keen interest. Leonard's anger was justified, but his vehemence suggested a deeper fear perhaps of losing control or of being outmaneuvered. Clara's defiance, meanwhile, was less about the treasure than about her need to shine, a trait Sir Henry had surely anticipated. The sketch, with its starred sundial, was a new clue, but Miss Marple suspected it was a decoy, meant to distract the greedy from the riddle's true heart. They're chasing shadows, she thought, while the light is elsewhere. Her thoughts were interrupted by Dr. Gray, who entered with a stack of books, his face pale and his spectacles askew. He froze at the sight of Leonard and Clara, his satchel slipping from his shoulder. "What's this?" Leonard demanded, rounding on him. "Another of your secret hunts, Edmund. You've been holed up in the library for days. What have you found?" Gray's lips trembled, but he drew himself up. "Nothing conclusive," he said, his voice thin. "Just historical context. The riddle may refer to the crypt or the manors, foundations." His eyes flicked to Clara's sketch, and Miss Marple saw the hunger in them. "Enough of this," Leonard growled, snatching the sketch from Clara's hand. "This is the first real clue we've had, and I'll not have you two bungling it. I'm going to the maze now to check the sundial again." He stormed out, the sketch crumpled in his fist. Clara, tears of frustration in her eyes, flounced after him, leaving Gray and Miss Marple alone. Gray sank into a chair, his hands shaking. "They'll ruin it," he muttered, half to himself. "They don't understand what's at stake." Miss Marple, rising to leave, paused by his side. "And what is at stake, Dr. Gray?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Sir Henry's treasure, or something more?" Gray started, his spectacles slipping down his nose. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, but his eyes betrayed him. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking once more. "You'll find, Dr. Gray, that Sir Henry's riddles reveal more than gold. Good day." She left him staring after her, his notebook clutched like a lifeline. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, the villagers' whispers fading into the night. Crow's intrusion, Clara's sketch, Gray's fear each, was a piece of Sir Henry's puzzle, designed to test not just wit, but character. The crypt, the maze, the lion, they were all signposts, but the true key lay in understanding Sir Henry's mind. "The wise shall see," she murmured, her eyes on the flickering flames, and Miss Marple, with her quiet clarity and her unerring sense of human folly, was beginning to see the path ahead. Chapter 8. The Shadow's Clue, the 7th day since the reading of Sir Henry. Ashford's will dawned with a brittle clarity over St. Mary Mead, the October sun casting a sharp, cold light that seemed to etch every detail of the village in stark relief. The mist that had clung to the lanes for days had lifted, revealing the russet hues of autumn leaves and the weathered stone of Ashford Hall, which stood like a sentinel guarding its master's secrets. The lion statue by the gate, its carved features softened by centuries, basked in the sunlight, its shadow stretching across the gravel path as noon approached. It was here, at this silent monument, that the pursuit of Sir Henry's riddle reached a new intensity. Driven by the cryptic directive, "Seek where the shadow falls at noon, where the lion guards the gate," Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat buttoned against the morning chill, arrived at the hall with her customary punctuality, her black straw hat pinned firmly in place. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, and her parasol, now more a prop than a necessity, tapped the ground as she walked. The events of the past week, Clara's discovery of the maze sketch, Silas Crow's midnight intrusion, Dr. Gray's secretive probing of the crypt had woven a complex web, and Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes were alive with the quiet thrill of untangling it. She took her place near the lion statue, her presence as unobtrusive as ever, yet her mind was a crucible, refining each observation into insight. The grounds were already astir with activity. Leonard Ashford, his surveyor's tape measure at the ready, stood by the lion, his broad face set in a scowl of determination. The crumpled sketch of the maze, now dog-eared from his constant handling, protruded from his pocket, a testament to his belief that the sundial held the key. This time, he declared to the small crowd of villagers who had gathered, "I'll not be fooled by Uncle Henry's tricks. The shadow at noon, 5 paces north, it's a matter of exactitude." His voice, though confident, carried an edge of desperation, as if he sensed the riddle slipping from his grasp. Clara Vane, her scarlet scarf a vivid contrast to the muted tones of the garden, flitted about the maze's entrance, her enthusiasm undimmed by yesterday's quarrels. She had abandoned the manor's dusty papers for the open air, convinced that the maze held the treasure's secret. "It's all about feeling, Leonard," she called, her violet eyes sparkling. "You can't measure a riddle like a road. The maze is alive, and I'll find its heart." She darted into the hedges, her laughter echoing, though Miss Marple noted a brittleness in her tone, a performer aware her audience was waning. Dr. Edmund Gray lingered at the edge of the scene, his satchel slung over his shoulder and his tweed cap pulled low. He had emerged from the library only reluctantly, his spectacles glinting as he studied the lion statue from a distance. His notebook, now bulging with sketches and cryptic jottings, was clutched tightly, and his thin frame seemed to shrink under the weight of his discoveries. "The shadow," he muttered, half to himself, "is a metaphor, not a measurement. It points to something else, something hidden." His eyes flicked to the maze, then back to the lion, and Miss Marple saw the conflict in them, a scholar, torn between revelation and concealment. Tom Briggs, the groundskeeper, was raking leaves nearby, his weathered face creased with a wry amusement at the relatives' antics. He caught Miss Marple's eye and tipped his cap. "They're at it again, miss," he said, leaning on his rake. "Chasing shadows, as if Sir Henry'd make it that easy." Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a bench with her knitting. "Sir Henry was fond of shadows, wasn't he, Tom? Did he ever speak of this one?" Tom scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing. "Not in so many words, miss, but he'd stand by that lion at noon, watching the shadow like it was telling him something. Said once, 'Shadows show what the sun don't.' Queer, but that was his way." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind seizing on Tom's words. Shadows, in Sir Henry's world, were not mere absences of light, they were clues, deliberate and precise. She watched as Leonard positioned himself by the lion, his tape measure stretched taut, his pocket watch ticking toward noon. The villagers, drawn by the promise of drama, hushed, their eyes fixed on the statue's shadow as it crept across the gravel. Clara, emerging briefly from the maze, joined the crowd, her scarf fluttering like a flag. Gray, still apart, scribbled in his notebook, his lips moving silently, at precisely 12. Leonard marked the shadow's tip with a chalk line, his movements brisk. 5 paces north, he muttered, striding forward with measured steps. He stopped at a patch of bare earth, its surface undisturbed, and knelt to examine it. "Nothing," he growled, his hands sifting the soil. "No markers, no stones, just dirt." The villagers murmured, some disappointed, others smirking at his failure. Clara laughed, a high, tinkling sound. "Oh, Leonard, you're too literal. Turn to fate, the riddle says. Maybe it's not north at all, maybe it's a direction of the heart." She spun toward the maze, her enthusiasm infectious, but under IRECTED. Miss Marple, rising from her bench, approached the lion statue, her parasol tracing the shadow's edge. The sunlight, now at its zenith, cast the shadow not onto the gravel, as Leonard assumed, but across the iron gate's bars, where it formed a fleeting patina series of lines and curves that resembled a key. She paused, her breath catching, and tilted her head to study the effect. The bars, ornate and rusted, twisted into a design that caught the shadow perfectly, as if Sir Henry had planned it. "A key," she murmured, her eyes narrowing, not in the earth, but in the light. She said nothing aloud, aware of the villagers' curious glances, and resumed her stroll, her mind alight with possibility. Leonard, undeterred by his empty-handed search, turned his attention to the gate, his frustration mounting. "If not the ground, then the gate itself," he said, running his hands along the iron bars. He tugged at them, testing for hidden compartments, but the gate held firm, its hinges groaning. Clara, re-entering the maze, called back, "You're wasting your time, Leonard. The sundials, the key, I'm going to check it again." Her voice faded into the hedges, and Miss Marple noted the shift in her focus. Clara, for all her impulsiveness, was circling back to the maze's heart, where the sundial waited. Dr. Gray, who had edged closer to the lion, knelt to examine the statue's base, his fingers probing the stone. "The shadow's a guide," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "It points to the maze, or beyond it." He glanced at the gate, then at Miss Marple, who met his gaze with a serene smile. "You're very thorough, Dr. Gray," she said, her tone disarming. "Have you found anything in the library to explain the shadow?" Gray started, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Nothing definitive," he said quickly, "just theories. The lion may be heraldic, linked to the estate's origins." But his eyes betrayed him, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of a secret he was not ready to share. The afternoon unfolded with a flurry of activity, each relative pursuing their own interpretation of the riddle. Leonard, abandoning the gate, marched to the maze, his map in hand, determined to remeasure the sundial's clearing. If the shadows a misdirection, he told a villager who followed him, then the sundial's the true focus. "I'll check every inch." Clara, already at the sundial, was scraping moss from its surface, her gloves stained green. "There's got to be a clue here," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "A hidden catch, or an inscription we missed." She pressed the stone, as Miss Marple had in the crypt, but found nothing. Gray, returning to the library, was intercepted by Leonard, who demanded to see his notes. "You've been hoarding information, Edmund," Leonard accused, his voice low and menacing. "If you've found something, you'll share it, or I'll make sure you regret it." Gray's face paled, but he clutched his notebook tighter. "I've found nothing you haven't," he said, his voice thin. "Just historical context, nothing more." Leonard snorted, brushing past him, and Gray hurried into the manor, his steps uneven. Miss Marple, lingering by the gate, approached Tom Briggs, who was sweeping the gravel path. "Tom," she said, her tone conversational, "you mentioned Sir Henry's walks in the maze. Did he ever come to the lion at dusk, as well as noon?" Tom paused, his broom still. "I miss, now you mention it. Dusk was his time, morn. Noon, he'd stand here, watching the shadow stretch, like it was talking to him. Said something once, dusk is when the truth shifts. Made no sense to me, but he was smiling, like he'd solved a puzzle." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Dusk," she repeated. "How very like Sir Henry to see truth in the twilight." The villagers, growing restless, began to drift away, their interest piqued but unsatisfied. The absence of Silas Crowe, who had left the village under Constable Dobbs' stern warning, was noted with relief, though Miss Marple suspected he was not far gone. Lydia Finch, the journalist, had set up her typewriter near the hall's gates, her latest article painting the relatives as bumbling treasure hunters. Clara, spotting her, waved cheerfully, oblivious to the mockery, while Leonard glowered, his pride stung. Gray, safely ensconced in the library, was rumoured to be cross-referencing medieval texts. His obsession with the Riddle's historical roots consuming him. Miss Marple, as the sun began its descent, walked slowly around the lion statue, her parasol tracing the shadow's path once more. The key-like pattern on the gate had vanished with the shifting light, but its image lingered in her mind. Sir Henry, she realized, had crafted a riddle that played with time and perspective. Noon revealed one truth, dusk another. The relatives, fixated on physical clues, were blind to this subtlety, their greed and haste obscuring the riddle's deeper intent. They see the shadow, she thought, but not what it shows. She returned to the maze, where Leonard was measuring the sundial's base with a ruler, his face red with exertion. Clara, nearby, was sketching the sundials. Inscription, tempus, veritatem, revelat, her pencil moving with uncharacteristic focus. "It means something," she said, catching Miss Marple's eye. "Time reveals truth, doesn't it? Maybe we need to wait for the right moment." Miss Marple nodded, her smile encouraging. "A wise thought, my dear. Sir Henry was fond of moments, wasn't he?" Clara beamed, unaware that Miss Marple's mind was already elsewhere, piecing together the riddle's temporal clues. As dusk fell, the grounds grew quiet, the villagers retreating to their homes and the relatives to the manor. Miss Marple lingered by the lion, watching the shadow lengthen across the gate once more. The pattern was different now, softer, less defined, but it still suggested a key symbol, perhaps of the riddle's resolution. "Dusk," she murmured, "is when the truth shifts." She turned toward the village, her step light despite the hour, her mind alive with the riddle's possibilities. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm against the evening's hush. The shadow's clue, fleeting and elusive, was a turning point, a sign that Sir Henry's treasure was not a thing to be dug up, but a truth to be seen. Leonard's measurements, Clara's instincts, Gray's scholarship each was a piece of the puzzle, but none held the whole. "The wise shall see," she whispered, her eyes on the flickering flames. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and her gift for seeing through the shadows of human nature, was closer than ever to the heart of Sir Henry's jest. Chapter 9. The heart revealed the 8th day since the reading of Sir Henry. Ashford's will broke over St. Mary Mead with a serene stillness, as if the village, exhausted by its week of fevered speculation, had paused to catch its breath. The October sun, low and golden, bathed the countryside in a soft glow, gilding the rooftops and casting long, languid shadows across the grounds of Ashford Hall. The maze, with its tangled use and silent sundial, stood at the heart of the estate. A verdant enigma that had drawn the relatives' hopes and frustrations like moths to a flame. It was here, in this labyrinth of green, that the riddle's promise, the heart of the maze, holds the key. But only the wise shall see was destined to find its resolution, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was ready to witness its unveiling. Miss Marple arrived at the hall in the late afternoon, her black straw hat tilted against the sun's glare, her tweed coat buttoned snugly against the autumn chill. Her knitting bag hung from her arm, a familiar prop that belied the sharpness of her mind, and her parasol tapped the gravel path with a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The events of the past days, the shadows, key-like pattern on the gate, Clara's maze sketch, Dr. Gray's cryptic sketches, and the village's restless stir had converged in her mind like threads in a tapestry, each revealing a facet of Sir Henry's intricate design. She sensed that the riddle's climax was near, and her mild blue eyes were alight with the quiet thrill of anticipation. The maze's entrance was deserted when she arrived, the relatives having scattered to their separate pursuits after the morning's fruitless searches. Leonard Ashford, his patience worn thin, had retreated to the manor to consult architectural plans, convinced that the riddle pointed to a hidden chamber beneath the hall. Clara Vane, her enthusiasm waxing and waning like the moon, was rumoured to be in the village, charming Miss Finch into another interview for her tabloid. Dr. Edmund Gray, ever the solitary scholar, had returned to the library, his notebook now a labyrinth of its own, filled with annotations on medieval symbolism and estate history. The villagers, their interest dulled by repetition, had largely abandoned the hall's gates, leaving the grounds to the rooks and the rustling leaves. Miss Marple, undeterred by the quiet, made her way to the maze, her steps deliberate. The hedges, though overgrown, retained their ancient geometry, their paths winding in a pattern that seemed to mock the unwary. She navigated them with care, her parasol brushing against thorns, until she reached the clearing at the maze's heart. The sundial stood there, its stone weathered and mossy, its bronze gnomon casting a faint shadow across the Latin inscription, Tempus veritatem revelatim, reveals truth. She paused, her gloved fingers tracing the stone's edge, and recalled Tom Briggs' words about Sir Henry's dusk visits, his mutterings of shifting truths. "The heart," she murmured, "is where you hid it, isn't it?" Her intuition, honed by years of observing human nature, told her the sundial was more than a marker. It was the riddle's fulcrum, the point where Sir Henry's jest would resolve. She knelt, her eyes scanning the stone's base, and noticed again the faint seam she had seen days before, now more pronounced in the slanting light. It was subtle, disguised by moss and time, but unmistakable to one who looked closely. She pressed it gently, then harder, but the stone remained firm. Not with force, she thought, straightening. Sir Henry would demand finesse. She was not alone for long. Tom Briggs, his rake slung over his shoulder, appeared at the clearing's edge, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Back again, miss," he said, tipping his cap. "You've a nose for this maze, like Sir Henry himself." Miss Marple returned his smile, her tone conversational. "It's a peaceful spot, Tom. You said Sir Henry often came here at dusk. Did he ever work on the sundial, perhaps clean it or adjust it?" Tom scratched his chin, considering. "Aye, now you mention it, he did fuss with it sometimes. Used a little knife to scrape the moss, like he was looking for something. Never said what, mind you, just smiled and went on his way." Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, gave a faint click. "A knife," she repeated, her mind racing. "How very precise of him. Thank you, Tom. You've been most helpful." Tom nodded, oblivious to the spark he had ignited, and ambled off to his duties. Miss Marple turned back to the sundial, her fingers probing the seam with renewed purpose. She lacked a knife, but her parasol's metal tip might suffice. She scraped gently at the moss, revealing a hairline crack that circled the base like a hidden hinge. Her heart quickened, but she worked slowly, aware that haste could ruin all. The sun was sinking now, its light bathing the clearing in a warm amber glow. Miss Marple, guided by a sudden instinct, aligned herself with the gnomon's shadow, which stretched toward the maze's western path. She recalled the Riddle's earlier clue 5 paces north, then turned to fate, and realized that fate might not be a direction, but a moment, a shift in perspective. At dusk, the shadow's angle changed, pointing not to the ground, but to the sundial itself. She pressed the seam again, this time twisting slightly, and felt a faint click. The stone shifted, revealing a narrow cavity beneath the sundial's base. Inside was a small iron box. Its surface rusted but intact, its lid engraved with a lion's head. Miss Marple's breath caught, not from excitement, but from the weight of understanding. This was Sir Henry's treasure, hidden not in gold or jewels, but in something he valued far more. She lifted the box carefully, its weight light but significant, and pried it open with her parasol's tip. Within lay a collection of ancient manuscripts, parchments, and vellum. Their edges brittle, their script faded but legible. They were historical documents, likely from Sir Henry's travels, priceless to scholars, but meaningless to the greedy. A note in Sir Henry's spidery hand rested atop them, to the wise who see beyond the glitter. Guard these, for they are truth. Miss Marple closed the box, her mind alight with the elegance of Sir Henry's jest. The riddle had been a test, not of cunning, but of character, challenged to value knowledge over wealth. She knew the relatives would not see it so, their dreams of gold too vivid to accept parchment as treasure. She resolved to reveal the find, but on her terms, ensuring Sir Henry's legacy was honoured. Slipping the box into her knitting bag, she made her way out of the maze, the dusk deepening around her. She had not gone far when the relatives, alerted by Tom's casual mention of her presence, converged on the hall's grounds. Leonard, his coat askew from hours over blueprints, was the first to arrive, his grey eyes narrowing at the sight of Miss Marple's calm demeanour. "What's this?" he demanded, striding toward her. "Have you been in the maze, Miss Marple? Found something?" "Perhaps." Clara, her scarlet scarf trailing, hurried after him, her face alight with hope. "Oh, Miss Marple, tell us. Is it the treasure? A chest? A keyas? Something marvellous?" Dr. Gray, last to appear, clutched his notebook, his spectacles glinting with a mix of dread and anticipation. Miss Marple, standing by the lion statue, met their gazes with serene composure. "I have indeed found something," she said, her voice steady. "In the maze, at the sundial's base, as Sir Henry intended." She lifted the iron box from her bag, its lion engraving catching the fading light. The relatives surged forward, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of excitement and suspicion. Leonard seized the box, his hands trembling as he pried it open. His face fell as he saw the manuscripts, his jaw tightening. "Manuscripts," he scoffed, tossing one aside. "This is his treasure, a pile of old papers. It's a jest, a cruel one." Clara, peering over his shoulder, gasped, her violet eyes filling with tears. "Oh, it's nothing. No gold, no jewels, just dusty scraps. Uncle Henry's tricked us." She sank onto the grass, her scarf slipping, her dreams of grandeur shattered. Gray, however, pushed forward, his thin hands reaching for the manuscripts with a reverence that bordered on obsession. "You fools," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "These are priceless medieval charters, lost histories. They're worth more than gold to those who understand." His eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple saw the scholar's hunger. untainted by greed but marred by selfishness. She stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her gentle tone. Sir Henry hid his treasure. In plain sight, she said, her words cutting through their clamour. The riddle was never about wealth, but wisdom. The lion's shadow, the maze's heart, the crypt's carvings, they all pointed to this, to a legacy of knowledge. He knew you'd chase glitter, but he hoped you'd see truth. Her eyes met Gray's, and he flinched, as if her words had pierced his carefully guarded facade. Leonard, his anger boiling over, rounded on her. You knew, didn't you? Poking about, pretending to be harmless with your knitting. You've cheated us. Miss Marple's smile was unruffled. I merely followed Sir Henry's clues, Mr. Ashford. They were there for anyone to see, if they looked with clear eyes. Clara, wiping her tears, looked up, her voice small. But why? Why make us run in circles for this? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Because, my dear, he wanted you to learn what matters. Not all treasures shine. Gray, clutching a manuscript, muttered, I suspected. The crypt, the sundial. But I thought it was a key to something greater. His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple saw the conflict in him, a man who valued the find but craved the glory of its discovery. She turned to Tom, who had joined the group, his rake forgotten. Tom, would you fetch Mr. Percival, the solicitor? He should see this, to ensure Sir Henry's wishes are honoured. Tom nodded, his respect for her evident, and hurried off. The relatives, their emotions raw, fell silent, the weight of their failure settling over them. Leonard, his pride stung, stormed toward the manor, muttering about legal challenges. Clara, her tears drying, gathered her scarf and followed, her dreams of fame now a distant echo. Gray, still holding a manuscript, lingered, his eyes on Miss Marple. You saw it all along, he said, his voice low. How? She smiled, her needles clicking faintly. I saw Sir Henry, Dr. Gray. His riddle was his mirror, and it showed us all. As dusk deepened, Miss Marple stood by the lion statue, the iron box safe in her bag. The maze, the crypt, the shadow, they had all led here, to a truth Sir Henry had cherished above all else. The villagers, soon to hear of the find, would gossip anew, but Miss Marple cared only for the riddle's resolution. The wise shall see, she murmured, her eyes on the fading light, and Miss Marple, with her quiet clarity and her unerring sense of human truth, had seen it all. Chapter 10. The Final Riddle, the 9th day since the reading of Sir Henry. Ashford's will dawned over St. Mary Mead with a quiet solemnity, as if the village, having borne witness to a week of fervent treasure hunting, now exhaled in relief at the puzzle's resolution. The October sky was a pale, unblemished blue, and the air carried a crispness that hinted at winter's approach. Ashford Hall, its sandstone walls, softened by morning light, stood as a monument to the drama that had unfolded within its grounds. The lion's shadow, the maze's sundial, the crypt's carvings, all leading to the iron box of manuscripts Miss Jane Marple had uncovered the previous evening. Yet, for Miss Marple, the riddle's end was not the end of the story, but the beginning of its deeper truth, a final reckoning of motives and morals in the style of Sir Henry's intricate jest. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room of Ashford Hall, her black straw hat resting on a side table, her tweed coat folded neatly over a chair. Her knitting bag lay at her feet, its contents untouched, for her hands were still, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the faces of the gathered relatives. The room, with its faded grandeur velvet curtains heavy with dust, portraits of stern glaring from the walls, was a fitting stage for the denouement. The fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering shadows, but the warmth did little to ease the tension that hung like a fog. Leonard Ashford, Clara Vane, and Dr. Edmund Gray sat in uneasy silence, their expressions a mix of resentment, shame, and reluctant curiosity, while Mr. Percival, the solicitor, stood by the mantel, the iron box of manuscripts at his side. Miss Marple had summoned them here, with Mr. Percival's consent, to explain the Riddle's resolution and ensure Sir Henry's wishes were honoured. The manuscripts, now spread carefully on a mahogany table, were the heart of his legacy parchments of medieval charters, illuminated pages from forgotten monasteries, and maps of ancient trade routes, each a treasure to historians but a bitter disappointment to those who dreamed of gold. The relatives, still reeling from yesterday's revelation, watched her with a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. Aware that this unassuming woman had outwitted them all, Leonard, his broad frame rigid in a high-backed chair, broke the silence, his voice thick with suppressed anger. "So, Miss Marple, you've had your triumph," he said, his grey eyes narrowing. "You found Uncle Henry's so-called treasure papers, of all things. But what now? Are we to applaud your cleverness and go home empty-handed?" His tone was bitter, his pride bruised by the Riddle's anticlimax, and Miss Marple noted the clench of his jaw, a man unaccustomed to being outmanoeuvred. Clara perched on a velvet ottoman, her scarlet scarf draped artfully across her shoulders, gave a small, theatrical sigh. "Oh, Leonard, don't be so beastly," she said, her violet eyes darting to Miss Marple. "I'm simply heartbroken. Miss Marple, those manuscripts are dreadfully dull, aren't they? I thought we'd find something splendid, something to make us famous." Her disappointment was genuine, but her flair for drama softened it, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of hope in her gaze, as if she still believed a twist might redeem the tale. Dr. Gray, seated apart, his thin hands clutching his notebook, was the most subdued. His spectacles glinted in the firelight, and his face was pale, as if the weight of his own secrets had drained him. "They're not dull," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "They're extraordinary, priceless to the right minds, but I should have seen it sooner." His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw the conflict in the scholar's reverence for the find, tempered by the shame of his own ambition. He had coveted the manuscripts, not for wealth, but for the fame their discovery would bring, and the Riddle had exposed that flaw as surely as it had the other's greed. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, and stepped to the table, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the iron box. "Sir Henry's riddle," she began, her voice clear and steady, "was never about gold or jewels, though he knew you'd think so. It was a test, a mirror held up to your hearts. The lion's shadow, the maze's sundial, the crypt's carving stay, were all signposts, but the true treasure was here, in these manuscripts, and in what they reveal about you." She paused, her eyes moving from face to face, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Leonard snorted, crossing his arms. "A test. It was a cruel jest, nothing more. He dangled a fortune before us, then laughed from the grave when we found scraps of parchment. And you, Miss Marple, how did you know, you, with your knitting and your village ways, saw what we missed?" His words were sharp, but there was a grudging curiosity beneath them, and Miss Marple's smile was unruffled. "I knew Sir Henry, in a way," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Not as a friend, but as a man who loved precision and truth. His riddle was crafted to reward those who looked beyond the obvious, who valued knowledge over glitter. The shadow at noon, you see, did not fall on the ground, as you thought, Leonard, but across the gate's bars, forming a Kia symbol, not a tool. The 5 paces north led to the maze, but turn to fate meant a moment, not a direction. At dusk, the sundial's shadow pointed to its own base, where the box was hidden. Sir Henry hid his treasure in plain sight, knowing only the wise would see. Clara leaned forward, her eyes wide. But the crypt, Miss Marple, those carvings, I thought they were part of it too. Were they just decoration? Miss Marple's smile deepened. Not decoration, my dear, but confirmation. The lions, mazes, and keys in the crypt echoed the Riddle's motifs, a nod to Sir Henry's love of history. He restored that crypt, you know, and spent hours there, sketching. I suspect he drew inspiration from it, weaving its symbols into his puzzle. The lion's eye, slightly larger than the other, was a clue I tested, though it led nowhere. It was his way of keeping us guessing. Gray, his voice trembling, spoke up. I saw a tooth, the inscriptions. I found references in the library to medieval hiding places, mechanisms in stone. I thought the crypt held the key or the manor's foundations, but I kept it to myself. His admission hung in the air, heavy with regret, and Miss Marple's gaze softened. You saw much, Dr. Gray, but you let ambition cloud your vision. Sir Henry knew that, too. His note in the box, to the wise, who see beyond the glitter, was meant for you, perhaps as much as anyone. Mr. Percival, who had listened in silence, cleared his throat. Miss Marple's explanation is quite correct, he said, his dry voice cutting through the tension. Sir Henry confided in me, years ago, that he valued these manuscripts above all his possessions. He acquired them in Egypt and Turkey at great personal risk, and believed they belonged to the world, not to one man's vault. His will, as you know, places the estate in trust for a year. But the manuscripts are to be donated to the British Museum with a stipend for their cataloguing. Your annuities remain, but the Riddle's reward is this: the chance to be part of a legacy greater than gold. Leonard's face darkened, but he said nothing, his hands clenched in his lap. Clara, her tears welling anew, reached for a manuscript, her fingers hovering over its delicate surface. They're beautiful, in a way, she said, her voice small, but I wanted something more. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. We all want more, my dear, until we learn what's enough. Sir Henry hoped you'd learn that, too. Gray, his shoulders slumping, set his notebook on the table, its pages spilling open to reveal sketches of the crypt, the sundial, and the lion. I knew they were manuscripts, he confessed, his voice breaking. I found a letter in the library, years old, from Sir Henry to a scholar friend. It mentioned parchments of inestimable worth, hidden for safekeeping. I wanted to find them first, to present them to the world under my name. I was a fool. His admission, raw and unguarded, silenced the room, and Miss Marple saw the weight lift from him, as if truth had freed what ambition had bound. Clara, wiping her eyes, turned to Miss Marple and me. Miss Marple, what did I do wrong? I tried so hard, running through that maze, talking to everyone. Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's smile was gentle. You tried, Clara, with all your heart. But you sought fame, not truth. Your letters to Miss Finch, your chatter with Mr. Croth, they invited chaos, as Sir Henry knew they would. He wanted you to see that the spotlight blinds as often as it reveals. Leonard, his anger cooling into resignation, leaned back, his eyes on the manuscripts. And me, I suppose I was too stubborn, measuring every inch like a clerk. But I don't see how that's a crime. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. It's no crime, Mr. Ashford, but it's a limitation. You trusted numbers over insight, force over finesse. Sir Henry's riddle asked for flexibility, for a mind open to the unexpected. You were close, but you looked down, not up. The room fell silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Mr. Percival, sensing the moment, stepped forward. Sir Henry's wishes are clear, he said, gathering the manuscripts. These will be sent to the museum, with a note crediting Miss Marple's role in their discovery. As for the estate, you may remain here for the year, as the will allows, or return to your lives. The choice is yours. He paused, his eyes flicking to Miss Marple. I believe, however, that Sir Henry would be pleased with this outcome. Leonard rose, his movements stiff. I'll stay, he said, his voice gruff. Not for the manuscripts, but for the hall. It's still ours, for now. He glanced at Miss Marple, a grudging respect in his eyes, and left the room. Clara, gathering her scarf, hesitated, then approached Miss Marple. You're extraordinary, she said, her smile wistful. I wish I'd seen what you did. I'll go back to London. I think perhaps the stage needs me more than this old house. She kissed Miss Marple's cheek and flounced out, her step lighter than before. Grey lingered, his notebook still open. I'll help catalogue the manuscripts, he said, his voice firm despite his pallor. It's the least I can do. Sir Henry deserved better from me. Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. He'd be glad of that, Dr. Gray. Knowledge was his treasure, and you can honour it now. Gray managed a faint smile, gathered his things, and followed the others. Leaving Miss Marple and Mr. Percival alone, the solicitor, locking the manuscripts in the iron box, turned to her. You've done a remarkable thing, Miss Marple, he said, his dry tone warmed by admiration. Sir Henry chose his riddle well, but he couldn't have foreseen you. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, I think he might have, Mr. Percival. He knew human nature, and he knew St. Mary Mead. A village, you see, is a riddle all its own. She rose, gathering her hat and bag, and stepped into the hall, where the evening light streamed through dusty windows. Outside the grounds were quiet, the lion statue bathed in twilight. Miss Marple paused by it, her parasol tracing the shadow's edge one last time. The key-like pattern was gone, but its memory lingered, a testament to Sir Henry's genius. The village, soon to hear of the manuscript's fate, would gossip anew. But Miss Marple cared only for the truth she had uncovered, not just the treasure, but the hearts it had revealed. Leonard's pride, Clara's vanity, Gray's ambition, they had all been laid bare, and in their failings they had found a chance to grow. She walked back to her cottage, the lanes now dark, the stars pricking the sky. At her door, Tuppence greeted her with a yawn, and Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. The final riddle, she knew, was not Sir Henry's, but life's how to see clearly, to judge kindly, to find treasure. In the ordinary, the wise shall see, she murmured, her eyes on the flames. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and her unerring sense of the human soul, had seen it all as Sir Henry had known she would. Epilogue's autumn deepened in St. Mary Mead. The village settled back into its familiar rhythms, the fever of Sir Henry Ashford's riddle cooling like embers after a fire. The crisp October days gave way to November's chill, and the lanes, once alive with whispers of treasure, now hummed with the mundane chatter of harvest suppers and church bazaar. Ashford Hall, its sandstone walls softened by frost, stood quiet, its gates no longer thronged by curious onlookers. Yet the echoes of the riddle lingered, a subtle undercurrent in the village's collective memory, and for Miss Jane Marple, the affair remained a study in human nature, its lessons as enduring as the manuscripts it had unveiled. Miss Marple, seated by her cottage window on a grey afternoon, worked her knitting needles with the steady precision of a metronome, a skein of soft grey wool unspooling in her lap. Her view of High Street was framed by lace curtains, and she watched the village go about its business. Mrs. Cleary bustling to the post office, young Billy Turner kicking a stone along the pavement, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, hurrying to a parish meeting with a basket of hymnals. The manuscripts, now safely in the hands of the British Museum, had been hailed as a historical find, their pages yielding insights into medieval trade and monastic life. Articles in scholarly journals praised Sir Henry's foresight, and a small plaque, funded by his estate, was to be placed in the museum, crediting Miss Marple's role in their discovery. The village, however, preferred its own version of the tale, embroidered with exaggerations of hidden vaults and midnight chasers. The relatives, whose pursuit of the riddle had stirred such drama, had scattered to their separate paths, each marked by the riddle's revelations. Leonard Ashford, his pride chastened but not broken, remained at the hall, overseeing its upkeep as the trust's year ticked on. He had softened, Mrs. Price confided over tea, taking an interest in the estate's history and even consulting Dr. Gray on its archives. "He's not so grand now," Mrs. Price said, her eyes gleaming. "Talks to Tom Briggs like a man, not a lord." Miss Marple, sipping her Darjeeling, nodded. "Adversity, my dear, is a fine teacher, if one listens." Clara Vane had returned to London, her dreams of treasure replaced by a renewed zeal for the stage. Miss Finch's articles, though tinged with mockery, had given her a fleeting notoriety, and she secured a role in a West End review, her name in small print but her ambition undimmed. She wrote to Miss Marple, a breezy letter full of theatrical gossip, thanking her for unravelling Uncle's beastly puzzle and promising a ticket to her opening night. Miss Marple, folding the letter with a smile, saw Clara's resilience as a kind of victory, proof that even a flawed heart could find its way. Dr. Edmund Gray, true to his word, had joined the museum's cataloguing team, his scholarly rigour now tempered by humility. His articles on the manuscripts, published under the museum's aegis, were meticulous and unadorned, free of the self-aggrandizement that had once driven him. He visited St. Mary Mead once, calling on Miss Marple with a rare diffidence. "You showed me what I couldn't see," he said, his spectacles glinting in her parlour's soft light. "Sir Henry's riddle was my mirror, and I didn't like the reflection." Miss Marple, offering him tea, replied, "Mirrors are kind, Dr. Gray, if they help us change." He left with a lighter step, and Miss Marple sensed he had found peace in his work, if not in fame. The village itself had not escaped the riddle's touch. Silas Crowe, the antiques dealer, had not returned since his midnight expulsion, but his name lingered as a cautionary tale, a warning to children who strayed too far from honesty. Lydia Finch, the journalist, had moved on to fresher scandals, her typewriter silent in St. Mary Mead, though her articles still surfaced in the Blue Boar, passed around with chuckles and eye-rolls. Tom Briggs, ever loyal to the hall, took pride in his small role, regaling the inn's patrons with tales of the Sundial's secret, his weathered face creasing with mirth. "Miss Marple knew," he'd say, raising his pint. "She always does. The church crypt, its carvings now a point of local pride. drew occasional visitors, historians, and curious tourists, guided by the vicar, who spoke of Sir Henry's generosity with a newfound reverence. The lion's uneven eye, though unyielding, became a village legend, a symbol of secrets just out of reach. Miss Marple, visiting the crypt one Sunday after service, paused by the hooded figure with its key, her gloved fingers brushing the stone. "You were his muse, weren't you?" she murmured, her eyes twinkling. The crypt, like the maze and the lion, was a piece of Sir Henry's mind, a testament to his love of history and his faith in those who sought it. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the affair over a cup of cocoa, tuppence purring at her feet. The riddle had been more than a puzzle, it was a parable, a lesson in what people chase and why. Leonard's ambition, Clara's vanity, Grey's pride, they had all been tested, and in their stumbles they had grown. The village, too, had learned something, its gossip tempered by a grudging respect for the quiet woman who saw what others missed. "Treasure," she mused, her needles clicking, "is only what we choose to see. Sir Henry knew that, and he trusted me to show them." Her thoughts drifted to Sir Henry himself, a man she had known only through his legacy, his manuscripts. Now illuminating the past for scholars were his true wealth, but his riddle was his masterpiece, a game that revealed the players as much as the prize. She imagined him at the sundial, his notebook in hand, smiling as he hid the iron box, knowing the chaos it would unleash. "You were a sly one," she said aloud, her voice soft with admiration, "but you believed in wisdom, didn't you? Even in a world that craves gold." The village, as winter loomed, turned its attention to new matters: a dispute over the church roof fund, a scandal involving the baker's apprentice, the annual Christmas pageant. Miss Marple, ever present at the heart of it, listened to the gossip with her usual patience, her mind already sifting the next puzzle life would bring. She attended the vicarage tea, where Mrs. Harmon fretted over the pageant's costumes, and the post office, where Mrs. Cleary speculated about a new family moving to the village. Each conversation, each glance, was a thread in the tapestry of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple wove them with care, her quiet presence a steadying force. One evening, as snow dusted the lanes, Miss Marple received a parcel from the British Museum, small booklet bound in leather, detailing the manuscript's significance. A note from Dr. Gray, written in his precise hand, thanked her for her inestimable clarity and invited her to a lecture on the find. She smiled, setting the booklet on her shelf beside her gardening manuals and prayer books. "A fitting end," she said to Tuppence, who blinked in agreement. The manuscripts were safe, the riddles solved, and the village, for now, at peace. Yet Miss Marple knew that peace was fleeting, that human nature, with its tangle of hopes and flaws, would soon spin another mystery. She welcomed it, in her way, for each puzzle was a chance to see, to understand, to guide. As she settled into her armchair, the fire casting shadows on the walls, she opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their dance. The world, she thought, was a maze of its own, and she, with her quiet wisdom and her unerring eye, was ready for its next turn. "The wise shall see," she murmured, her voice lost in the crackle of logs. And Miss Marple, in the heart of her village, saw it all as Sir Henry had known she would.